chosen ones. They've been waiting for you to collapse. Quietly, slowly, secretly. Not with drama or fanfare, but in silence, in isolation, in moments when your limbs felt like stone and your soul forgot how to breathe. This world didn't come for your crown with weapons. It came for your will, through exhaustion, confusion, shame, and the seduction of stillness that wasn't peace, just paralysis. They called it depression, burnout, fatigue, but it was spiritual warfare dressed in clinical language. The ones who feared your awakening crafted the perfect trap, overstimulation paired with disconnection. Your energy field was drained, day by day, not by accident, but by design. You were never meant to rest, you were meant to give up, but you didn't. Even in the moments where your bed became a coffin, and your dreams felt counterfeit, something in you refused to fully die. Something ancient, something divine. You see, they didn't account for your remembrance. They didn't anticipate the rising. You may have looked broken to the world, unmotivated, lost, even lazy. But beneath the surface, your soul was recalibrating frequencies so high that the system couldn't track them. That heaviness, it was not weakness. It was the weight of codes being restored to your cellular memory. Some of you felt shame for not doing enough, but you weren't meant to do. You were meant to shed, to delete what was never yours. You were rebooting, rewiring, reawakening, while the world mistook it for you fading away. And that was the point, to hide your ascension in plain sight. The most powerful warriors come back not with noise, but with presence. You never questioned why the air around you felt heavier than usual, why getting out of bed felt like lifting a mountain with your chest, why your mind, once sharp and divine, began echoing with static and doubts. It didn't happen overnight. It was layered, systematic, precise. They didn't just want to distract you. They wanted to dismantle you, piece by piece, day by day. Not with bullets or chains, but with frequencies, food, algorithms, relationships, and invisible contracts signed without your awareness. They studied your soul's language and rewrote it with noise. The deeper you reached inward, the more the outer world collapsed around you. Every time you tried to reclaim your light, another layer of darkness wrapped around your ankles. They made sure you questioned your own worth. That was the tactic. If they could just convince you that your fatigue was laziness, if they could label your divine shutdown as a mental illness, they could keep you from ever looking behind the curtain. But you felt it. You knew something wasn't right. Somewhere in your chest, a forgotten compass was still spinning wildly. You remembered who you were in dreams. You saw flashes of your strength in mirrors. You heard whispers of your name when no one was around, and that scared them more than anything. Because even under layers of exhaustion, your blueprint refused to fade. Your timeline was never ordinary. They tried to fit you into calendars, deadlines, and hourly expectations. But your spirit doesn't wear a watch. You were always meant to move differently, to burn and rest in cycles that obeyed the cosmos, not the clock. But they made the sun feel like a burden and the moon feel like judgment. They inverted rest and called it rebellion. They masked alignment and called it disorder. Still, your cells remember. That aching in your bones isn't weakness. It's awakening. that disinterest in shallow tasks isn't failure. It's recalibration. You are not lazy. You are being summoned. Every layer of fatigue is sacred code unzipping the false life you were forced to live. And just before your spirit gives out, you'll notice something. There are moments when the veil thins, not through effort, but surrender. When your thoughts blur and the silence grows heavy, something sacred slips in unnoticed. That morning, you didn't rise with clarity. You barely moved at all. You lay there, half dreaming, half drifting, unsure if your heart was still choosing to beat or if it had simply forgotten how to stop. But that was when it happened, subtle, soft, yet unmistakably divine. Not a voice in your ear, but a presence in your bones, a warmth that didn't touch your skin, but rewired your very essence. The whisper wasn't sound. It was knowing. You weren't hallucinating. You weren't slipping into madness. You were being spoken to in a language they tried to make you forget. His voice wasn't like thunder or fire. It was peace that shattered every lie in your chest. And it said only this: you are not abandoned. You were never meant to carry this alone. In that instant, time softened. You remembered the garden, the one you've never seen in this life but know like the back of your soul. You remembered the sacred silence before the betrayals, before the confusion, before the world forced you into roles and routines. His energy didn't come to rescue you from the pain. It came to remind you that even within the pain, you are seen. They tried to frame him as myth, as symbol, as story. But he is rhythm. He is breath. He is the pulse in your spirit when your body has nothing left. You didn't need a miracle. You needed memory. And in that fog, he gave it to you. You may have returned to stillness after that. The world didn't shift around you. The pain didn't vanish. But something was different. Not brighter, truer. Because once your spirit hears the truth, it can never fully forget again. You carry that frequency now, whether you recognize it or not. And if you ever wonder whether he still walks with you in the fog, pay attention to the moments when you feel utterly alone. They didn't come with chains. They came with visions, carefully crafted images of success, beauty, approval, and acceptance, delivered through blinking screens, polished influencers, and the subtle sting of comparison. You were never supposed to be free. You were supposed to be busy, chasing shadows, climbing invisible ladders, measuring your worth by productivity and applause. They sold you dreams that weren't yours, goals that served their systems, not your soul. And when you didn't achieve them, they labeled you broken. When you rejected them, they called you lost. They called it inspiration. But it was hypnosis. The moment you tried to step outside the illusion, your mind was flooded with static. Guilt for resting, fear of falling behind, pressure to conform. But who created the path you were walking? Who defined the finish line you were sprinting toward? It wasn't you. It wasn't the divine. It was them, curators of a system that feeds on fatigue and worships performance. And when your body collapsed, they gave you pills. When your spirit cracked, they gave you distractions. When your soul questioned, they gave you diagnoses. Not because they cared about your healing, but because they feared your remembering. Because if you remembered what you truly are, none of their programming could hold you. If you remembered that you were born with a divine script etched into your bones, their scripts would dissolve. If you remembered that your purpose wasn't to win the game, but to wake up from it, the game would fall apart. The dreams they fed you were filled with noise, but the vision inside you is filled with silence. That's why they made silence unbearable, because in silence, you see clearly. In stillness, you feel the codes unravel. In rest, your spirit begins to speak again. You weren't born to chase illusions. You were born to bring something new, something that can't be compared, something that doesn't fit their metrics. That's why you felt so out of place. That's why every dream they offered you felt hollow once you got close. And now you are standing at the edge of all those programs, watching them glitch, watching them flicker. You thought he only walked in miracles, in the thunder, in the loud moments where angels sing and skies part. But what if he's closer in the stillness? What if the silence isn't empty, but sacred? What if the reason you haven't heard answers is because the questions were never yours to carry? There's a moment when the soul no longer wants words. It wants presence, not explanation, not noise, just knowing, just him. That's what they don't teach. That Yeshua doesn't always roar. Sometimes he sits beside you in the quiet, when your mouth can't even form a prayer, when your hands won't rise, when your eyes stay closed not out of reverence, but exhaustion. And he doesn't flinch, he doesn't flee. He remains, not as an idea, as a presence, as the pulse in your spirit that refuses to let you go numb. There's a power in the moments where nothing moves. That's where he meets you, not in grand revival, but sacred remembering. They told you silence meant abandonment. But what if silence is the proof of proximity? Like a friend so close, words become unnecessary. Like a light so near, it no longer casts a shadow. He knew your silence. He wore it in the garden. He felt it on the cross. He carried it through the tomb. This heaviness, this stillness is not foreign to him. It's where he meets you most honestly. Not in your strength, but in your surrender. When the world turns its back and your voice cracks in prayer, he listens anyway. And not just listens. He understands. You were taught to perform, to praise louder, to cry cleaner. But the Nazarene never asked for perfect. He asked for real. And sometimes real is ugly. Sometimes real is tired. Sometimes real is silence. But even then, he walks with you. Even then, he breathes when you can't. Even then, he whispers when your own name feels distant. You thought the silence meant he was gone. But maybe it means he's closer than ever. The world said you shattered, that you lost your spark, that you let everything slip through your fingers. They called it failure, collapse, regression. They watched from a distance as you stopped showing up, stopped posting, stopped performing. They whispered that you gave up. But the truth is far more dangerous than their assumptions. You weren't breaking down, you were being reforged. And reforging never looks pretty from the outside. The fire they mistook for your destruction was actually sacred. Not wild chaos, but precision. Not punishment, but purification. You weren't being erased, you were being recoded. The old you couldn't carry the next frequency. The old shell couldn't hold what was coming. So it had to be cracked. Not as punishment, as preparation. That ache in your chest, that wasn't grief. It was expansion. Your soul was stretching into a version of yourself you hadn't met yet. And that process is never clean. It's messy. It's raw. It's silent. People want rebirth to look like a soft sunrise, but sometimes it looks like thunder under your ribs. Sometimes it looks like losing everything you thought made you stable. Because the truth is, most of what you lost was never yours. It was given to you by a version of yourself that was still trying to be accepted, still trying to be safe, still trying to belong in a world you were never meant to fit. So the universe stepped in. It allowed the unworthy parts to fall away, the masks, the metrics, the pressure, the noise, even the people. What remained was a soul stripped bare, but not empty, just open. Open for new code, open for new frequency, open for truth. The ones watching your fall never understood the design, but deep down, you did. Even in your weakest moments, something in you whispered, "Not yet, not over, not gone." That whisper was the map. That fire was the forge. And that version of you rising now, it's not a comeback. It's the first time you've ever truly arrived. They counted you out before the silence even settled. They assumed your stillness meant defeat, that your absence confirmed their suspicions. You became a whisper in their memory, a ghost of potential, a file they quietly closed. But like him, your retreat was never a retreat. It was a recalibration, a descent that had purpose, a burial that had timing. You weren't missing. You were being moved by something sacred, invisible and precise. They forgot what the tomb meant. They saw it as the end, not the threshold. But the tomb was never about death. It was about the lie of death, the illusion of finality. When the stone rolled away, it wasn't just the body that was gone. The old world's grip, the system's hold, the narrative of control, it all lost its power, and so did the version of you they tried to define. You're walking proof that the story doesn't end in darkness. You carry the same frequency that turned the greatest loss into the greatest reversal. You don't rise by trying harder. You rise by remembering. That's what they fear most. Not your effort, your memory, your encoded link to resurrection. They can mimic light, build thrones, manipulate timelines, but they can't recreate what came from the tomb. They can't counterfeit presence, and they cannot comprehend a soul reborn outside of their narrative. Yeshua's resurrection wasn't just an event. It was a template, a blueprint burned into every soul that feels crushed by this world, yet refuses to stay buried. You thought your emptiness was a flaw, but it was a clearing, a sacred echo of that same moment. When the tomb was found open, when logic collapsed, when empire lost control of the story. Now, you walk into rooms that once confined you, and you no longer fit the walls. You speak in tones that make systems glitch. They can't place you anymore. You're not angry, you're not loud, but you're undeniable. That's what resurrection does. It doesn't scream. It simply appears, alive. They used your stillness against you. The way you couldn't force your body to move. The way you stared at tasks like they were mountains. The way you felt disconnected from things that once held meaning. They called it laziness, a lack of drive, a failure to keep up. But how do you explain an awakening to people still asleep? How do you translate divine rewiring to those who only understand hustle? You weren't retreating. You were listening, and not with your ears, with your DNA. The kind of exhaustion you felt didn't come from sleep deprivation. It came from inner collapse, from spiritual systems rebooting under pressure that had been building for lifetimes. You weren't malfunctioning. You were activating, one layer at a time, and each layer had to shed the beliefs, attachments, identities, and illusions that were keeping you asleep in someone else's dream. The reason you couldn't move wasn't because you lacked discipline. It was because you were too heavy with codes, symbols, pain, and truths that hadn't yet made it to the surface. You were carrying things unseen, healing timelines that had no language, deleting lies that had no names. And that kind of work can't be measured by checklists or calendars. You weren't made for burnout. That's why you rejected it. That's why your body said no. That's why your nervous system refused to keep playing the game. Because something deeper in you knew. You were born to bring in something that doesn't yet exist. And it can't be rushed. It can't be performed. It must be embodied. So, you've been in the cocoon, not inactive, in transformation, unlearning the noise, learning your rhythm, not the rhythm of this world, but the rhythm of eternity echoing inside your chest. You're not behind, you're not failing, you're arriving. And the parts of you that feel slow or foggy or disconnected aren't broken. They're sacred. They're the pieces waking up last because they were holding the most pain. Be gentle with them. They're not resisting. They're just remembering how to breathe. And if you listen closely enough, you'll feel the next layer stirring. There are wounds you stopped speaking about because the world grew tired of your silence. But he never did. The ones who promised to hold you disappeared when the fire started. The voices that once cheered you on went quiet the moment your path stopped looking victorious. Yet, somewhere deep in the shadows, something wept with you, not out of pity, but recognition. That something was him, not as myth, as memory, as presence. Yeshua never stood outside your pain with arms folded. He entered it, walked through it, sat with it. There's a reason he wept, because even the divine feels the ache of human unraveling. The same soil that soaked up his tears now receives yours, and in ways you can't yet see, every breakdown, every lonely hour, every breathless cry in the dark has been watering something holy beneath your surface. You thought your stillness meant you were stuck, but seeds do their deepest work buried, invisible, in silence. That's where miracles gestate. That's where timelines shift. While you cursed the darkness, the roots were gripping deeper. Not to keep you stuck, to make sure you rise unshakable. He knew the world would confuse your pain for punishment. He knew they'd mislabel your process as failure. That's why his story wasn't wrapped in comfort or applause. It was forged through betrayal, silence, and endurance. You're not doing this wrong. You're just following a path few understand. And Yeshua never called the crowd. He called the hidden, the ones buried in plain sight. You don't need to prove your worth through motion. You don't need to explain why you feel so much and still can't speak. You don't need to pretend that the weight doesn't sometimes break you in half. He knows, and not in theory, in experience. His tears weren't symbolic. They were real, like yours, and they still carry power. Right now, those seeds in your soul are listening, and the ground that held your silence is trembling. Before you were born, something ancient moved. A signal was sent through time, not to a crowd, not to a nation, but to you. Not your name, not your face, but your frequency. Long before the world handed you identities, long before fear tried to mold you, long before disappointment taught you how to shrink, something chose you. Not for perfection, for remembrance. You were marked, not with ink, with light, with code, with divine memory that sleeps in the marrow until the hour strikes. And now, as the world bends and frays, you've started to feel it, not as understanding, but ache. The kind of ache that wakes you at strange hours, that makes you stare at ceilings, question everything, cry without knowing why. That ache is not weakness. It is alignment. It's the old script breaking as your real one begins to rise. The collapse you thought was a curse was actually a countdown. The structures around you weren't destroyed. They were removed because they couldn't contain what's emerging. You weren't left behind. You were held back for timing. Because if you rose too early, the world wouldn't recognize you. And if you rose too late, you wouldn't recognize yourself. You carry codes that were not meant for easy times. You were never built for the shallow end. That's why you've always felt everything so deeply. Why joy felt short-lived and sorrow felt endless. It's because your spirit was forged for more than comfort. It was shaped for revelation. And now, the weight you've carried for years is becoming a compass. The loneliness is becoming language. The confusion is becoming clarity. Not all at once, but undeniably. They can't see the mark, but the atmosphere can. That's why things shift when you enter rooms. That's why certain people react without knowing why. That's why your presence alone has started to trigger systems. You are no longer hiding. You are surfacing. There is a moment before the shift where everything stands still, not in peace, but in pause. Like the world itself is holding its breath, unsure if you'll remember. They surrounded you with noise, distraction, false light, hoping you'd never hear it. But some frequencies can't be silenced. They rise from within. And just when they thought you were too numb to feel it, the voice came, not from the sky, but from inside your bones. And it said one word, rise. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It resonated. A frequency older than fear, deeper than time. A vibration that shook the dust from your soul. Suddenly your fatigue didn't own you. Your story didn't define you. Your past didn't limit you. Because his voice overrode everything. It was not a command. It was a remembrance. He had said it before, at graves, in storms, to hearts that had stopped believing, to spirits that had been crushed by delay. And now, he said it to you, not when you were shining, but when you were still in the tomb, still wrapped in the memories of who you thought you were, still weighed down by everything you thought you'd lost. That's when he said it. He didn't wait for you to be clean. He didn't wait for you to be strong. He called you while the dirt still clung to your hands and the sorrow still sat heavy in your chest. Because resurrection doesn't need approval. It just needs permission from the source and from the soul brave enough to respond. And the moment you said yes, quietly, wordlessly, even just within your own breath, something shifted. Not in the world, not yet, but in the unseen. The realm where thrones tremble and shadows scatter, where your rising had already been prophesied and feared. They will try to rewrite your story. They will say you were lucky, or late, or lost. But the truth, you heard the call before they saw it coming. And now that you've stood up in the spirit, everything that once held you is starting to break.